Welcome to the Grief Ladies, the practical guide to what comes next. I'm Kelly Doherty.
And I'm Karen Arnold, and we are two grief professionals with over 50 years of combined experience. We're here to validate, educate, and give you tangible tools you can actually use.
Each episode motivates you to take action and reminds you it's okay to want to feel better. This is the Grief Ladies, a guide to what comes next.
Hi, and welcome to the Grief Ladies podcast. I'm Karen Arnold here with Kelly Doherty, and today we are welcoming our guest, Nichole Lee. Very glad to have you here with us today, Nichole. I'm going to do a bio.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So we'll be telling a little bit more about you in a moment, but just to let everybody know, this is, we go through our grief framework, and today we're going to be focusing on the letter E for evolving, which is often, talking about some of the complicated emotions, things that come up in terms of esteem as a person is navigating their grief journey. So we've got so much to talk to Nichole about today, and she's going to share a lot of what she does. But first, we always like to tell a little bit more about our guest. So Nichole Lee guides high-level leaders through moments of deep transition when grief, identity, and truth collide. After 20 years leading transformation work for Fortune 500 companies, her mother's death in 2018 marked a turning point, giving rise to work that helps others let go of who they've been and step into who they're becoming. So, Nichole, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Karen and Kelly, for having me. It's such an honor to be here.
Well, great. We're excited to have you and really be talking about grief and loss. And so we know from some of the information that you shared with us prior to signing on today, you talk about emotions as energy in action. So we would love to have you kind of explore that a little bit and tell us what that actually means and how does a grieving person maybe be able to express those emotions instead of maybe putting them behind a wall or trying to avoid them like so many grieving people like to do.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much for that. So if we even think about the word emotion, I think whether it's Latin, but the root literally means energy in motion, right? It is when we're having these responses, our body is moving energy, literally, right? And so that may show up in your body as your heart racing or even sweating or elements of fidgeting and things of that nature. And so I always say starting with the feeling in the body, not necessarily emotion that you may respond to, is often helpful because so many of us were disconnected from our bodies. And I think that's why sometimes it feels uncomfortable or even foreign to start to articulate what's happening inside of us, particularly when it comes to something like grief, that many of us, and why you even have this podcast, right, and why we do this work, was not something we were educated on or informed about, right? So, and we start to, one of the simple things I share with people is if we think about, we all have been on the highway or interstate, right? And we see all these different cars moving. And when things are flowing, the traffic is awesome. And we love that, right? When we estimate leaving our house and it's supposed to take 10 minutes and it does, we're like, the traffic is flowing, right? When we go through some type of response, life transition, things we're talking about, grief, there is a traffic jam. The energy starts to get stuck, right? And so I use that because sometimes even talking about grief can feel overwhelming. But when I say, can you remember the time you were on a highway and all of a sudden there was an accident to the side or a detour? Do you remember how you felt? Yes, because everything was blocked, stopped. We had to make a detour or we had to pause. That's what's happening in your body. So maybe before the grief, you felt like you were flowing. Things felt like you could move appropriately. Maybe you didn't have any challenges with breathing or just even thinking. And then grief happened and you had a traffic jam. Something got stuck. And so when we think of it that way, it anchors in something in a real life experience that is sometimes that's separated, right, from the actual grief situation or circumstance. And then we get to name it, which is the actual feeling, right? The emotion is the movement of that is no longer happening, say, with that traffic jam. And then we say, well, what does that feel like to you? What do you label that as? That is anger, that is sadness, that may be stuckness, it may be confusion. And so, as we allow ourselves to name without judgment, that's when we also open up parts of our brain and body to learn how to express. And the reason why I share that as well, when we talk about people having challenges with even expressing themselves, what I found with many of my clients is they have actually received information or stories or narratives or traditions that emoting things from the body, expressing themselves is something you don't do. It's seen as
Yes.
a sign of weakness or not being able to be appeared as strong or grounded, right? So many times it's permission to allow yourself to express in a way that perhaps you were never given the opportunity to do so. And that's been something really profound for me as I do this work as someone who grew up who was able to express, recognizing, and this isn't a gender thing, because I also think that sometimes emotions and how we move with emotions is genderized. It has nothing to do with gender. There are people across all spectrums who have felt this way or they have received negative responses, right? Consequences for their expression of how they felt or how they thought. So I just wanted to anchor in that because I think giving permission and allowing a safe space to do that is one of the key things that I've recognized from doing this work.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I love that analogy of the highway because I also think it's sometimes, we talk about these emotions being the roadblock emotions, right? And so I
Yeah.
also think it's sometimes with grief, it's we're forced to get off of that highway and we have to go a totally
Yes.
different way that we've never been before in our life, right? And we don't even know how to
Yes.
navigate those roads. It's all unnew, it's all unfamiliar, and it's scary, and I think
Hmm.
it's just a great way to kind of think about grief and an understanding of this is like being on that, being stuck, and then even being off of it. And where do you go from here? And how do you find your way?
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned it can be scary, and I think those are things of allowing ourselves to recognize that as well, and particularly working with high level, high performing individuals, that's sometimes where it feels very difficult because you have been so resilient, right? And you've learned all the routes. I think we could probably use that across the board, like this metaphor, right? And so when you have a moment that you have to take a detour and you don't have the map, right? You've had the map or the playbook for a lot of things in your life, and now you don't have that map, and you're like, "What the heck do I do?" And then there's when you talk about self-esteem, that's where a lot of that self-persecution comes from. I've been able to solve everything else. Right? I've been able to overcome every place else. And now I'm in a situation that I need help and I don't know how to describe what it is that I need. So I love that you said that because I do think that sometimes, particularly again for the clients I work with, that's where some of the resistance or even that self internalization of judgment comes from because they've had a plan or a map for mostly everything in their lives. And that was my situation. Losing my mother as someone who is a high performing, quote unquote, successful person, self aware, and feeling so ill equipped, so confused, so blocked was so difficult for me. And I did not have an outlet because I didn't know where to go or even how to explain what was happening to me.
Yeah. I think sometimes what can be hard, and I find I work with a lot of people who could say that they've been successful in their work or in, different parts of
Mhm.
their life. And sometimes that makes it particularly difficult because it feels like the things that helped them get there are not working. Any of that problem
Mhm.
solving or, any of the skills that they had just don't seem to work when it comes to grief. And so I think sometimes it can be particularly frustrating, maybe for people who felt like they were able to manage other things well. Nicole, you had mentioned about other types of losses, and I really do like to talk about this because Kelly and I are often working with people who have had a loved one die, but along with
Mhm.
that they are dealing with that, but maybe dealing with other things too. Like, what are some of the losses that you encounter and some of the big life transitions that can also, in conjunction with the loss of a loved one or even on its own, create a very specific type of grief?
Are you ready to take the next step on your grief journey with real tools and compassionate guidance? The Grief Ladies are launching a brand new workshop series based on their signature grief GRIEF framework. 5 trail markers to help you find your footing after your loss: grounding, rebuilding, interacting, evolving, and finding. Each workshop focuses on one trail marker, guiding you through practical steps to move from surviving to living again, all in a space that's honest, supportive, and real. Led by grief experts Kelly Doherty and Karen Arnold, these workshops combine decades of experience with tools you can start using today. Visit griefladies.com to explore the upcoming workshops, because you don't have to climb this mountain alone.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that, Karen, because if we even start with a loss of a loved one, which is where I started my journey, what was so eye-opening when I started allowing myself to reflect on the other things I felt I lost, right, was my identity, my connection, even the relationship of a daughter, right, to my mother. I took care of my mother for the 4 months that she was ill. So even separating from that caretaker role, the loss of clarity in what my life could look like. Like I started questioning who I really was, what was my purpose in this world. So that identity piece is really, really challenging, right, for many people, regardless of loss. Also, when it came to my career, I made a decision to leave my career behind that was, again, quote unquote, successful by other people's standards. And there was a loss of those 20 years, right, as it relates to connection, community, the work I was doing. So I think also just people trying to better understand um, those relationships, right? Your relationships change as a result of a loss. You can have financial losses along with whether it's tied to a loved one or on its own. One of the things I would love to just bring up is what we're experiencing, particularly around the world, as we start to look at and be having access to social media of other people losing their lives, losing their freedom, losing their sense of security. Those are all losses that oftentimes aren't brought to the forefront that we're collectively grieving. Even people, when we see celebrities now, right, we see that information all the time, and you could have a strong connection to someone you've never met and it have even more of a significant impact than, say, someone who's in your day to day life. So, those are a few that come to mind that I think sometimes aren't considered. And then when we think of I'm a person who's transitioning menopause, right? So I'm learning, wow, there's a loss of maybe the body I had, the control I thought I had as it relates to my nutrition or my workouts. Those are other things that often we don't look at. You can grieve going through a seasonal cycle in your life, men and women. So I could go on. I actually have a list on my website with over 70 plus different types of losses that individuals actually may have not even considered. And oftentimes I share that, Karen and Kelly, and people are like, yep, that's me. Whoop, that's me, right? A loss of a dream. I thought I was going to have this life, and now it's this one. We talk about job loss all the time, right? So I do think I appreciate you bringing that up because I think people listening would be like, wow, I didn't think about all of those different things that could be considered one, losses, but two, actually create an emotion tied to grief. And it may have been categorized as sadness, yet that still could be creating the same symptoms and responses overall from a grief perspective.
Yeah. Well, I think it also comes down to just so much change, that it happens
Hmm.
as we, move through different parts of our life and we get further and further away from a life that we recognize, a version of ourselves that we recognize, and everything becomes really unfamiliar. And, it's interesting. A lot of times, as I think we're working with people, we are trying to highlight some of these things. And I remember in my early work, I would, do a program and list secondary losses. And I almost felt bad. I'm like, guys, I'm sorry I'm putting all of this up on the board here. Like it just is the saddest list of things. But then I was like, the whole point though is to help people see here's everything that you're going through. Because what I know is how often people are diminishing their feelings and their experience and feeling like I should be better, I should be further along, I shouldn't be feeling this way. I think a lot of times people go for support because they feel like they're not doing it right or that they should be doing it better.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important.
And
I love the idea
I,
of that list.
Yeah, and I love your idea of your list because and I think the thing from what you said too is and I think part of why this work is so important is the complexity of it, right? And the personalization of it. And I think sometimes there's a bit of some too much simplicity tied to this conversation. And so to recognize that one loss can lead to many experiences of loss is so important. And I love that you have that. And sometimes it can feel difficult, like, oh my gosh. But I've also seen on the flip side the oh my gosh of I didn't recognize that, yes, it's 10 things that are happening. And this is why I'm oscillating between emotions. And this is why I'm not sure, what's happening inside of me because I didn't realize that there were secondary and tertiary losses going on. Right. So I appreciate you bringing that up. And I think that's also people will start to think like just something as a simple question of what do I feel like I lost? And what are other things that I feel like I'm losing as part of this journey and allowing those things to surface, right? Because again, I think that simplicity lens, like, yes, I'm grieving. It was my mother. And then to your point, I did an exercise where I'm like, all these things from my identity as a daughter to what my life is going to look like, to what my relationships are going to look like, it became a huge list, right? I'm not laughing like it's funny. I'm laughing from recognizing how I simply was just like, "Oh, my mother died." And it was like, "Oh, it's way more than that. Way more than that."
Yeah, and I also think, it's all so compounding, right? We also have our regular everyday life and everything that's happening, like you said, right? You could be going through menopause at the same time as grieving the death of your husband or your parent and so it's just compounding it and just makes it feel even more out of control and makes us feel more overwhelmed. And then we also, I think, grieve for the future losses that we may have. I
Mhm.
remember I met a girl and her sister had died and it was our very first session. Very new early grief, and she looked at me and she said, "My children are never going to have an aunt." Right? And she's
Mm,
she's a teenager, right? But that's what she was focused on is even those future losses that we're going to continue to experience and how
yeah.
challenging and difficult that can be. And recognizing that, it's we think that it's just in this time, but it's ongoing.
Mhm. Yeah, and I can relate to that, Kelly, because I mean, I never thought I would get into this work. I never saw myself as an entrepreneur, and to leave that world behind and be grateful that my mother gave me that gift, but to recognize that she physically wasn't here to celebrate it, right? I think there's the other part, like you're talking about, like, wow, my mom isn't here, though I feel she's with me, but that physical piece, and as someone who hasn't gotten married yet and had children, so I can definitely relate and empathize, right, with that experience. And that's where I had shifted a lot of it in recognizing the gift that was given to me as a result of that loss. And so that's a lot of the work I do is what is that piece? And this may not be for all losses, particularly for me. That's what moved me out of such the suffering and into the celebration and the appreciation of what was offered and given to me as a result of my mother passing.
Yes, that's exactly what I talk about all the time. But that
Well, I'm glad we're on the same page.
I have a chapter in a book coming out just about that. But you know,
Yes.
it's I think sometimes that benefit finding is really hard for people, right? They have
Mhm.
a hard time believing that anything positive can come out of something so challenging and difficult. And obviously, I'm way further out from my mom's death, and so it's very easy for me to see the
Mhm.
benefits that have come because of my entire life has been built on around this. But I think for
Mhm.
people in that early grief, trying to find those benefits or see that can be really difficult. So, how do you help people navigate that maybe in their early grief?
Yeah, I think the first that I typically do is actually better understanding what was their experience, their belief systems, their traditions, their typical response to adversity before we even get into the actual thing, right, that may have brought them to me. Because again, what I've come to realize is that some of that actually is from the subconscious belief systems, right? If you believed or you were taught that bad things happen and there's nothing good from it, well, this is just reinforcing what your belief system was that maybe you weren't even realizing was the case, right? Just similar to what I was mentioning with emotions. So many times it's self-discovery. And I love that you talk about this a lot, right? A lot of it is the exploration and self-discovery. And so oftentimes that can be a little bit easier for someone to talk about what their experiences were, what their beliefs are, what they're connected to, not connected to, how they've actually dealt with challenges in the past. Then we start to talk about the correlation to their experience in this particular moment. And I typically find there is such a connection point between that. So again, if you believe that good comes from things and that you can find learning and meaning, how we typically get through your grief process is reinforcing some of those things. If I find that those elements are not part of the core of who you are, then it's asking permission. Do you want to live a different life? Right? I often ask, are these things that really still align to you? Or do you see that you desire something different? And that's when we talk about things like self esteem and self worth. That didn't just come from this grief experience, right? This circumstance. That's been something that's been building and compounding over time. And perhaps this has just intensified it. So oftentimes I'll ask, do we want to look at your life and how you've been living as an opportunity related to this experience? And if that is an agreement, then we start looking at those in connection, right? We no longer compartmentalize these experiences. We look at them as holistically part of you, and how as we heal elements that have been underneath along with this grief experience, then that's where I find that it's much easier to get to integration, right? So a lot of my work is root, I would call kind of root work, of better understanding how someone ticks and them understanding how they tick to then get to those grief pieces. So there's a lot of self discovery work with the work that I do.
Yeah, well, and I think it's something it's such a life event that really does create opportunities for growth. And that can
Hmm.
be difficult, I think, for people to think about sometimes. A lot of times it's kind of happening by default, and but I think helping a person participate with it, talking about the idea, I think of like a growth opportunity, perhaps,
Hmm.
that comes out of really significant life changes. And I think people can be resistant to that sometimes. Nicole, I think you were kind of alluding to the challenges that may come with that. The way I try to present it to people is the idea of having choices and how
Hmm.
we don't get to choose these terrible things that happen. But then through time, we get to a point, well, what am I going to do with it? And where do I go from here?
Hmm.
One thing that I think is a bit of a barrier for people sometimes is that loyalty and the idea that their suffering is required to
Hmm.
remain connected and loving and loyal to their loved one. Do you see that? And if so, how do you help people navigate that barrier?
Yeah, I was nodding my head because I see that and I experienced that as well through my journey. I felt as though, and again, this is why I go into belief systems, because I didn't realize that my belief system underneath was, if I don't feel the depth of pain when I talk about my mother, then I don't love her the way that I did when she was here,
Mhm.
right? I lived into that for so long that I realized that even subconsciously, if I wanted to celebrate her or talk about her, I went straight into tears, because underneath was that pain must continue to exist. And that's where that loyalty, right? For me to really show the depths of love that I have for my mother.
Yeah.
And when I, like you say, choices, when I learned to free myself to say that I can still love her and that love does not change, but how I present myself is a representation of the love that I have for her. That's what shifted for me. So again, I say, in the particularly with the work I do, with my clients, based on my experience. And that's why I love when we do this work, because typically the people that we attract or come to us have some similar storyline, right? That the resonance of their experience. And so oftentimes that's why I do start with belief systems. And it's not always like, what do you believe, right? It's sometimes it's just having a conversation. Tell me more about yourself. Tell me how you dealt with this adversity and these circumstances. And then we start to recognize, it surfaces that, wow, I had a belief that I must hold on to that pain for me to be loyal. Or that's what I was taught, right? That in order to love someone, it must feel or look like this. And then that's when that element of the extension of choice and saying, well, let's look at, if you got to choose what you desire, do you want to hold on to that? Is that the story you desire to have? And then, depending on the depth of that, we may need to do somatic work, right, to help rewire the body. But I love that you mentioned that choice. But sometimes it's just having the conversation to help someone actually recognize. What I come to find is we typically have the wisdom within us. We just haven't had safe spaces to allow ourselves to explore.
Yeah.
As soon as you start allowing that co-creation, many times what I've seen with my clients is they're the ones that say, you know what? I just recognize I've been carrying this, or this was the belief from my family, or this is why this is happening inside of me. And then it's like, do you want that? No, I don't want that. Like, I haven't met someone that's like, yes, I want to hold on to this suffering. And then that's where the dual accountability to support each other comes from, right? But until we get that expression of, no, I actually don't want to hold on to this, I think, to your point, that's where the resistance comes, because it hasn't come out as an expression, an agreement that I actually don't want to hold this anymore. And so trying to push someone through something when they haven't declared that they're ready to move forward is where I see sometimes there's the challenges, with loved ones and fans and friends and family, right, who don't want you to be in pain, but we haven't come to a collective agreement that you're ready to move out of that pain either.
Mm.
Right, and I can't force you to get there. That's not being in integrity. But yeah, that was my experience, and I had support of really kind of looking through that, and that's where I freed myself. I freed myself from that anchor of suffering that I thought I had to hold on to.
Yeah, I feel like it's one of the most important things any of us can do in this work is help people recognize when there is a choice,
Mhm,
to feel differently. And it's hard because there's people listening right now that may feel very far away from this and really
mhm,
may feel like this is not their story or not possible for them, or find it difficult to recognize that we would ever hold on to a bad feeling. A lot of this stuff is unconscious, happening,
mhm.
below the surface, not things that we are actively or intentionally trying to do. But when that awakening starts to happen, it's like, do we take that opportunity? Um, and I think the fact that you've been able to do that and show that firsthand is just such a wonderful guide for people. It really
Thank
is. And
you.
it's a whole different way to honor, our
Mhm.
loved ones too.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that in honoring that individuals may not be there, and I think that's the beauty of the co-creation process, right? Is when you are ready, I think many times people don't always feel that someone will be there when they're ready. And so I think just that conversation of when you are ready or it's something that you're curious about, I'm still here for you. And I think that outside of being a practitioner, that was a thing that I learned before I got into this work is again, I think sometimes we don't realize that we're being selfish in us wanting people to heal in a certain way, right? Before I got into this work, and loved ones were taught to fix and solution and be there in the way that we think we should be there for someone. And these are the opportunities for us to say, you know what? I'm not in the driver's seat of your life. I'm here to be curious with you and I'm here to hold space. And if this isn't the time that you're ready, know that there's no expiration date on support, love, and care. And I think that goes a long way because sometimes why people aren't ready is also not feeling though once they open up to this new world or what they feel is a responsibility that they're going to be held through the process. And
Mhm.
that's what I've seen sometimes. It's like, okay, if I declare that I'm no longer suffering, who's going to actually be there to help me with this new life, this new path, this new journey that I also recognize I may grieve that in the process as well. So I think that's why having these discovery conversations, you start to better understand where that resistance or fear is coming from. Because to move into a new life, as we know, does come with loss, right? If you declare that you're no longer suffering and you're going to live a different life, there is an identity that you've held on to that now you're going to let go of. So now there's a new cycle of what you're going to go through, and perhaps different people or support systems that will help you get to that next path on your journey and creating your new map, right? Of the life that you want to live.
Looking for a grief community that actually feels supportive, not overwhelming? We built one. The Grief Ladies community on Facebook is a private, free space where you can connect with others who are navigating life after someone they love has died. Inside, you'll find weekly prompts, practical tools, conversations that feel real, not sugar-coated, and a place where your person is honored. If you want steady support and a community that understands what your days look like right now, come join us. Search the Grief Ladies community on Facebook or tap the link in our bio.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for everybody, that timetable looks very different. And so
Mhm.
for those people that are maybe earlier in grief, recognizing that this may sound really foreign and they may not believe that they can get there. But it is about, realizing that it's on each person's own timeline, and it looks very different and for many different reasons, right? Depending, I
Yep.
think, also on the number of secondary losses, depending on the compounded grief, you know, the relationships. Was it a traumatic loss? There's so many factors that go into how when somebody can get to that place.
Yeah, Kelly. And
And
and to your point, it's also recognizing in that whole we were talking about it, right? Your life circumstances, right? Like if you feel you don't have the capacity to work through that, that can be really difficult for you, right? So it might even be the season that you're in. You may not have the capacity that's necessary to work through certain things. And then to add, depending on what happened prior to this, again, right? Like if there's other things that have been compounding and this is in addition to that, it can be so overwhelming, so exhausting to even consider taking on that journey. So I love that you say that, and I think that's the reassurance that I feel a lot of people need is you're the only person who really knows all the things that have happened in your life, right? And so allowing yourself to be empowered to recognize that and help with deciding what your journey looks like and having those choices and options is the most empowering piece that I think that anyone can take away from their experience. It
yeah,
really does teach you how much internal power you can have when you just recognize that it is your journey and it is unique and it is personalized to you. And that's the part that I am grateful for of going through this journey that I never really realized how personalized these experiences were until I went through it, right? There is no magic wand right? For healing in general, right? We know it's not linear. We know it's not this box that you can be put in. And that's why it's so important that there's so many people that are here supporting, because it really depends on those circumstances of who will be part of your support system to help you navigate those challenges.
Yeah, definitely. So, we're going to switch gears, but not
Okay.
really, because I feel like this conversation kind of flows perfectly into our next topic.
Uh-huh.
And so each episode, we talk about celebrating their life and talking about how do we keep that connection? How do we continue to honor them? How can we shift from pain to living with the connection that still remains, right?
Hmm.
And celebrating their life rather than focusing on their death. And obviously, I feel like we've already kind of used that word celebrate. I don't know how many
Yeah.
times already today, so this is kind of perfect. Um, but I'm curious, what are the things that you personally do to celebrate your mom's life?
Yeah, so one is I look in the mirror every day because we look just alike. So I feel like it was like, "Mom, I've gotta get to this because I look in the mirror and I see you every day." So oftentimes with a certain smile or smirk, I literally am like, "Mom, I see you." Right? Like, and that may be something I may share with others. If you go to my social, people are like, "Oh my gosh, like you are literally twins." So that's one thing. I see her in me every day. The other is I still celebrate holidays. Like we were very big in giving cards. We're a big cards family. So I still buy my mother a birthday card. She's lucky 7-7. So it's a lucky day anyway. Mother's Day cards. So holidays have always continued to be a celebration. And I talk to my mother often, as I look to the work I do, advice. And I think this just depends on belief system, traditions, things of that nature, what your religious beliefs are. But I believe now that my mother's with me 24/7. So if I'm going through something, she's always there. She's literally a spiritual phone call away, right? At 2 in the morning or 2 in the afternoon. And so that's how my connection celebrating her. And then I have many of her things. So I kept a few things that were significant in celebrating her that way. And I talk about her often. Vicky Lee and Nikki Lee. So I talk about my mom. I'm telling you, Vicky and Nikki, and we sound alike. So, but yeah, I celebrate her on a regular basis, and things like this are my ways of celebrating her as well, right? Talking about my journey is a celebration of her and the gift that she gave me, and I think that's something also culturally that working through that comfort, right? We also, when you often share that you lost a loved one, people say, "Oh, I'm so sorry." And I appreciate that the celebration is me showing up the way I am and saying, "Thank you so much. But my mother gave me this amazing gift." And me talking about that way keeps Vicky Lee alive, right? Like literally, Vicky Lee is alive. So those are just a few things. There's probably more, but those are the ones that come to mind of just celebrating her life, her vivaciousness, my energy. We're very similar in personalities. So again, it's funny if you ever met my mom or people, they're like, "Oh my gosh, like I'm literally her in the next phase." She's still here literally through me.
I love that. Thanks.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you.
Well, Nicole, I think we had mentioned to you earlier that we also
Yes.
like to, sort of leave with an actionable step. Something that anybody who's listening that we're talking about these things,
Hmm.
and I think learning about it, having some validation is really important. But anytime we can put something into action or take a step, that very first step, that small move, whatever we do that could possibly shift things a little bit, what is something that you would suggest that could be a step that a person could take starting even today to help with some of what we've talked about today?
Yeah, I think since we teed off things around emotions, I think connecting to your emotions and feelings is one way that you can start. And one of the ways that I recommend is just closing your eyes, taking some deep breaths, and just allowing yourself to settle in your body and asking, what am I feeling today? And if that feels uncomfortable because you have a disconnection to your feeling, one of the things I also offer is describing how you're feeling like the weather.
Hmm.
So if it's hard for you to be like, I'm angry, I'm sad, right? If you were describing yourself like the weather, what would that be? If you're saying it's cloudy or there's heavy precipitation or it feels like a tornado came through, you can connect to that, right? And so that may help you start to say, okay, and then what does that mean in words? That's because I'm angry or I'm sad or I'm confused. So I think that's one that, regardless of where you are in your life, your comfort or maybe discomfort with emotion, is using the weather to describe that feeling. If you're more curious though of how to expand your vocabulary around feelings and emotions, I highly recommend looking up the feelings wheel, which I'm sure you both have used. Many times we've only had the angry, sad, mad, right? Like our five kind of core emotions. What I love about the feelings wheel is it allows you to expand what those feelings look like to you. And so if that's something you're working through, of having challenges of articulating how you're feeling, having something like a feelings wheel and just scanning through and be like, yep, I'm disappointed, or yes, I'm feeling anxious, can be a helpful, practical way to just start connecting to your emotions and your feelings.
Yeah, it's a great idea because honestly, it seems hard to imagine, but even as we are going through something, it can be really difficult
Hmm.
to articulate. I mean, sometimes I describe it just as like big ball of bad feelings, but to
Hmm.
really be able to say how I'm feeling, what my pain points are, and especially since it's shifting and changing so constantly, and because we're feeling a lot of the same things at different things, I should say, at the same
Hmm.
time, makes it hard. So I think that trying to find the language for it, because the communication and even again, just for our own sake, can be difficult. So Nichole,
Yeah.
it sounds like this is a lot of what you do with people.
Yeah.
So if anybody wanted to get in touch with you or learn a little bit more, what would be the best way for them to learn about you and to reach you?
Yeah, I think starting at my website would probably be best. All my socials are there. There's an inquiry form if you like to schedule a session, which I'm sure we'll have in the show notes. But it's Nichole Lee, Nichole.LOVE. So just going onto my site, you get a little dose of love in your life. But
Mhm.
again, all my socials are there. The resource that I mentioned around losses, there's some other resources that are free on my site as well. And through that, through the socials, I do access and communicate through all the socials. So if you do decide to reach out on Instagram or LinkedIn, I am the person responding to my to my messages. So I would love to hear from you from that way as well.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you, Nichole, so much. And Kelly, thank you for everything and for everyone that's listening. We appreciate you being here. And again, if you want to get in touch with Nichole, we'll have more information in the show notes and we'll be back next time where we will move on to the letter F. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Grief Ladies.
Don't wait to feel better to get started. Getting started is what makes you feel better. Put this week's tool to work.
If today's episode helped, share it with someone who needs it and leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you.
And remember, we're here for you, your trusted grief ladies, navigating this path together.